At one point, you were one cell. No memories, no thoughts, no heartbeat, no brain. Just one microscopic cell containing the starting instructions for a human being. And somehow, from that one cell came a nervous system capable of seeing this screen, understanding these words, recognizing people you love, and wondering how any of this happened. So how does that happen? And here's an even stranger question. Could your brain begin learning before you were even born? Welcome back to the Psychology Notebook. This is Lesson 19 in our Psych 101 series and the beginning of Module 4 on human development. In this lesson, we're rewinding your developmental clock as far as it can go. By the end, you'll understand the 3 major stages of prenatal development, how genes and the prenatal environment work together to shape development, and what a newborn may already be capable of sensing and recognizing before ever taking that first breath. And the last part is where things get especially interesting. Let's go back all the way to the beginning. Imagine we can press rewind on your entire life. You become younger, adult to teenager, teenager to child, child to toddler, toddler to infant, infant to newborn. Then we keep going, back before birth. The newborn becomes a fetus. The fetus becomes an embryo. The embryo becomes a tiny cluster of cells until eventually we reach the earliest version of you, one cell. This is where our story starts. Somehow, this one cell has an enormous mission ahead of it. It has to multiply, specialize, build a body, construct a nervous system, and prepare that developing organism to survive in a world it has never experienced directly. So let's hit play. Development begins at conception, when a sperm cell and an egg combine. The resulting single cell is called a zygote, and inside that zygote is a new genetic combination. But here's where we need to remember something from earlier in Psych 101. Genes are not a finished blueprint for the person you will become. They are part of the developmental process. From the very beginning, development involves an ongoing interaction between biology and environment, and almost immediately the zygote begins dividing. One cell becomes 2. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, then 16, and the process keeps going. But here's where things get interesting. Those cells cannot all remain identical. Eventually, some will become part of your nervous system. Others will contribute to muscle, skin, organs, bones, blood, and hundreds of other specialized structures. The same beginning, very different destinations. And this massive construction project starts during the first prenatal stage. The first stage is called the Germinal Period. It lasts approximately the first 2 weeks after conception. During this time, the developing cluster of cells continues dividing as it travels toward the uterus. Eventually, it develops into a structure called a blastocyst. But simply arriving isn't enough. It has to attach to the uterine lining. This process is called implantation. Think of implantation as the moment the construction site is established. The cells have been multiplying. Now the developing organism has reached the environment that will support the next phase of growth. And once implantation occurs, something remarkable begins. The basic structures of the body start taking shape. This brings us to the embryonic period, and this is where the place of development becomes extraordinary. From roughly week 3 through week 8, the developing organism is called an embryo. This period is relatively short, but an enormous amount happens. Basic body structures begin forming, the heart begins developing, early organs begin taking shape, and one structure is especially important for psychology. The neural tube forms. This tube will eventually develop into the brain and spinal cord. Think about what this means. The nervous system you use to think, feel, move, remember, and experience the world begins with a small, developing structure formed only weeks after conception. At the same time, cells continue becoming more specialized. This is called differentiation. A cell doesn't just need to divide. It needs to become the right kind of cell in the right kind of place at roughly the right time. And here's the part that surprises a lot of psychology students. Timing matters enormously during prenatal development. Different structures are developing at different times. That means the developing organism may become more vulnerable to certain environmental influences during some periods than others. We're going to come back to that because despite being physically protected inside the uterus, prenatal development does not occur inside a perfectly sealed bubble. But first, our developing nervous system has another transformation ahead. Beginning around week 9, we enter the fetal period. The developing organism is now called a fetus. The basic body plan has already begun forming. Now growth and refinement become major parts of the story. The body becomes larger, organs continue developing, movement increases, and the brain undergoes tremendous development. Connections are forming, systems are becoming increasingly organized, and eventually something changes that matters enormously for psychology. The developing nervous system begins responding to stimulation. Movement can be detected. Responses to touch develop. And later in pregnancy, sound becomes part of the fetal environment, which means the world outside is beginning to get in, not in the way you experience it now. There is no understanding of language or conscious interpretation like an adult would have, but sound reaches the developing auditory system. Voices, rhythms, patterns, especially sounds that occur repeatedly. Remember that, because we're going to return to it near the end of this lesson. For now, though, our development story has a problem. So far, development might seem like an automatic sequence. Genes activate, cells divide, structures form, a fetus grows. But development is more complicated than that. The prenatal environment matters too. The placenta helps provide oxygen and nutrients to the developing organism, but it is not an impenetrable barrier protecting the fetus from every environmental influence. Some environmental agents can interfere with prenatal development. Those are called teratogens. A teratogen can include certain chemicals, substances, infections, or other environmental exposures capable of harming an embryo or fetus. Alcohol is one well-known example. But here's where we need an important clarification. Prenatal development is not simply a system where exposure to something automatically guarantees one specific outcome. Risk depends on multiple factors. What was the exposure? How much? At what point in the development? How long did it last? And what individual biological factors were present? Remember those sensitive periods we mentioned earlier? This is why they matter. An environmental exposure may have very different effects depending on which structures are developing at the time. And the nervous system remains especially important because brain development continues throughout pregnancy and long after birth. This is another version of a theme we've encountered throughout Psych 101. Biology matters, environment matters, and development emerges from their interaction. Neither one tells the whole story alone. Now, our developing human has made it through months of extraordinary change, and then everything changes again. Birth. Think about how dramatic this transition actually is. Before birth, temperature is relatively regulated. Nutrients and oxygen are supplied through biological systems connecting the pregnant person and fetus. Sound is filtered. Light is limited. Then suddenly, the newborn enters an entirely different environment. Air, gravity, bright light, direct sound, touch, temperature changes, hunger, and the need to interact with other human beings. There is one problem. A newborn can't walk, can't speak, can't prepare food, can't move away from most dangers. Compared with many other species, human newborns appear incredibly dependent. So how does someone this helpless survive? Because newborns do not arrive completely unprepared. They come equipped with a small collection of automatic behaviors. Meet the newborn toolkit. Many newborn behaviors are reflexes. A reflex is an automatic response to a particular type of stimulation. Take the rooting reflex. Touch a newborn's cheek and the baby tends to turn toward the stimulation. It's as though the nervous system is saying, "Something touched my face, turn toward it." Then there's the sucking reflex. Once something reaches the baby's mouth, sucking can occur automatically. Found it, now eat. Place something against a newborn's palm and you may trigger the gasping reflex. The fingers close automatically. And then there's the Moro reflex, sometimes called the startle reflex. A sudden sensation of falling or loss of support can produce a dramatic response as the baby extends the arms, and then pulls them inward. These aren't behaviors a newborn sits down and learns from instructions. They're built-in responses produced by a developing nervous system, and many newborn reflexes eventually fade as voluntary control develops. But reflexes are only part of the story, because newborns aren't simply bundles of automatic responses. They're actually taking in information. A newborn's senses aren't identical to an adult's. Vision, for example, continues developing significantly after birth, but newborns can see, hear, smell, taste, and respond to touch. And some of their preferences are remarkably social. Newborns pay attention to faces. They respond strongly to human voices. They can distinguish odors. And over time, researchers can study what babies notice by watching something very simple. What happens when the same thing occurs again and again? At first, an infant may respond strongly to a new stimulus. But after repeated exposure, the stimulus often decreases. This is called habituation. Think of it as the nervous system saying, "I've encountered this before. I don't need to react as strongly anymore." Then researchers can introduce something new. If attention increases again, that tells us the infant detected a difference. And this gives psychologists an extraordinary window into a mind that cannot yet explain anything verbally. But now we can finally return to the question we've been carrying since the beginning. Did any kind of learning happen before birth? Remember the sounds that began reaching the developing auditory system during the fetal period? Researchers have found evidence that repeated prenatal exposure to certain sounds can leave detectable traces after birth. Newborns can show preferences and responses to familiar auditory patterns. One of the best-known examples involves the human voice. Newborns often prefer their mother's voice over unfamiliar voices. Researchers have also found evidence that repeated speech and sound patterns heard prenatally can influence newborn responses after birth. Now, we need to be careful about what this means. Fetus is not studying vocabulary. It isn't forming autobiographical memories like the memories you have of school, birthdays, or yesterday's lunch. But the developing nervous system can become familiar with repeated patterns, and that is a basic form of learning, which gives us the answer to the question we started with. Psychological development does not suddenly switch on at birth. By the time a newborn enters the world, months of biological development have already occurred. The nervous system has been developing. Sensory systems have been coming online. The fetus has been responding to stimulation, and some information from the prenatal environment has already become familiar. Birth is an enormous transition, but it is not psychological, page 1. And development doesn't slow down once birth occurs. Over the months and years ahead, psychologists track changes in movement, communication, learning, social behavior, and emotional development. We often describe these changes using developmental milestones. First smiles, reaching, sitting, crawling, walking, words, social interaction. But milestones need another important clarification. They are useful developmental guides. They are not a stopwatch that every child follows at exactly the same moment. Children develop with meaningful individual variation. That's why developmental monitoring looks at patterns of growth over time rather than treating one isolated behavior as a complete picture of a child. When concerns do appear, developmental screenings and early interventions can help identify children who may benefit from additional support. And once again, development is not destiny. The developing brain remains remarkably responsive to experience. So let's return to where we started. One cell. That cell divided. Those cells specialized. A body began forming. A neural tube developed into the beginnings of a brain and spinal cord. The embryo became a fetus. Fetus moved, sensed, and began responding to information from its environment. Then came birth, and the newborn entered the world already equipped with reflexes, sensory abilities, and evidence of very early learning. But now, something even more powerful is about to enter our developmental story. Another human being. Because newborns may arrive with reflexes, but they cannot regulate everything alone. They depend on other people for food, warmth, protection, comfort, and safety. And something starts happening when the same person repeatedly appears during moments of distress. The baby begins learning something very different, not just what a voice sounds like, but what safety feels like. And that brings us to one of the most influential ideas in developmental psychology: attachment. Why do babies become emotionally attached to particular caregivers? What did John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth really discover about those early bonds? And perhaps most interestingly, can the relationships we experience early in life influence how we approach love and closeness years later? That's where we're going next. If you're enjoying Psych 101 and want to keep learning in a way that actually makes sense, make sure you're subscribed to the Psychology Notebook.
Want a better way to learn psychology? I created a free visual psychology starter guide to help you see how the major ideas connect. Inside, you'll find 25 illustrated psychology flashcards, colorful visual maps, and beginner-friendly explanations covering the brain, memory, learning, personality, development, and more. Whether you're taking a psychology class or just curious about how people think and behave, this guide gives you a simple place to start. Download your free copy using the link in the description.
Thank you for learning with me, and according to YouTube, this video is perfect for you on your learning journey. Click it and I'll see you over there.